Hello. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to make a quick announcement. At the time of this episode's release, Minnesotans of all walks of life are suffering greatly at the hands of an occupation by ICE agents who are violating people's constitutional rights and waging a campaign of intimidation. Across Minnesota, ICE continues to stop, harass, and detain people regardless of their citizenship status. Normal life in Minnesota has been severely interrupted, as schools have been forced to close or go virtual, as people live in fear of leaving their homes or going to work or even going to the doctor. The good news is Minnesotans are organized and activated, and there are many, many ways that you can help. We urge everyone listening to head to standwithminnesota.com. This is the most comprehensive directory we know of for ways to help people in Minnesota right now. You can donate to dozens of grassroots organizations doing work on the ground. You can help pay rent for families who are affected, contribute to mutual aid funds, seek out legal training or advice, find ways to volunteer or direct actions to participate in, and so much more. And as a history podcast, we also want to highlight that standwithminnesota.com has a treasury of first-hand testimonies documenting people's real experiences during this trying time and ways for you to submit your own. History is being made right now by folks like you. So please, head to standwithminnesota.com. No matter who you are, where you live, or what resources you have, there are ways you can make a difference and help people right now. Once again, that's standwithminnesota.com. And now on to the show. Although we're only just releasing this now, we'd like to note that the conversation you're about to hear was actually recorded last October. Enjoy. From the land of sky blue waters, golden gophers, and swinish eyes, this is Minnesota Unknown. Each episode, we'll take a deep dive into Minnesota's storied past, with a special emphasis on the surprising, the unusual, and little-known history hidden in plain sight. My name is Alex Weston.
I'm Josie Bergman.
I'm Hannah Norton.
And we are Minnesota Unknown.
So, Alex.
Yes.
Who founded St. Paul?
Well, the traditional story is it was a man named Pierre Parrant, better known by his nickname, Pig's Eye.
That was St. Paul's name originally, correct?
That's what they say. If you look at pretty much any book published on the history of St. Paul, it'll tell you the original name was Pig's Eye. There's many versions of this, but the basic way that the story goes is there's this guy, Pierre Parrant. He's a disreputable fur trader, and he's commonly known as Pig's Eye because one of his eyes was closed to just a slit, and it reminded people of a pig's eye. By one account, it's a result of a knife fight. Sometimes it's just not known. And in the 1830s, Pig's Eye sets up an illegal saloon across from Fort Snelling, selling whiskey to the soldiers. And this causes all manner of discipline problems among the soldiers.
Are you saying that soldiers drinking whiskey could lead to misbehavior?
It certainly could and certainly did.
Oh my goodness.
At least that's the story.
What an outlandish idea.
Tired of Pig's Eye's antics, the military burns down his saloon, at which time he just goes further down the river and settles up a new saloon. And this ends up being the first structure in what would become St. Paul. And pretty soon there's a bunch of other people who have settled nearby Pig's Eye's saloon. And this saloon becomes the focal point for the new settlement, and soon a small community is there. And this whole community is known as Pig's Eye, or Pig's Eye's Landing. And allegedly, Pig's Eye even served as the official mailing address for the settlement. Until 1841, when the Catholic priest, Father Lucien Gaultier, establishes the first Catholic church. It's a little log cabin chapel near present-day Dayton's Bluff, and it's dedicated to St. Paul.
Finally, someone bringing some order to this rowdy town.
Exactly. So according to the story, Gaultier chastised the settlers for picking such an ugly name as Pig's Eye, and he instructed them that they were to adopt the chapel's name for the settlement and cease using Pig's Eye. In some versions, he dramatically gathers the townspeople and raises a cross above his head and proclaims, quote, "Pig's Eye converted thou shalt be, like Saul. Arise and be henceforth St. Paul." So that's the basic folklore, but some version of this is repeated in pretty much every book, starting with the first history published in 1876.
Do you think he had a French accent?
Oh, probably.
Can you do it again in a French accent?
Pig's Eye, converted thou shalt be like Saul. Arise and be henceforth St. Paul.
And then they served escargot.
So usually the way this story is told, it's always with a kind of pearl-clutching horror oh my gosh, that we had such a disreputable beginning. For example, here is a quote from J. Fletcher Williams, the first secretary of the Minnesota Historical Society. He wrote A History of St. Paul to 1875, published in 1876. And here's what he has to say.
He was a coarse, ill-looking, low-browed fellow, with only one eye, and that a sinister-looking one. He spoke execrable English. His habits were intemperate and licentious. Such was the man on whom fortune, with blind fatuity, thrust the honor of being the founder of our good city. Our pride almost revolts at the chronicling of such a humiliation, and leads us to wish that it were on one worthier and nobler that such a distinction had fallen. But history is inexorable, and we must record facts as they are. He, the immortal parent of our saintly city, it, the first habitation, the first business house of our Christian metropolis of today.
So yeah, you see what I mean about pearl clutching. And yet, St. Paulites have always taken a perverse pride in the fact that their city had such ignoble origins and such a colorful early name. Pig's Eye has been the namesake of several sports teams, of civic festivals, of businesses. In the 90s, there was even a brand of beer called Pig's Eye's Beer. Because after all, it's a great story. The only problem is, it's not entirely true. Yeah. So like most origin myths, there are true elements in this story, but the Legends of Pig's Eye takes a messy and complicated history and makes it tidy and simple. So before we can get to unpacking the story of Pig's Eye, we have to do a little scene setting. Hi, Alex butting in here from the future. At this point in the original conversation that you're listening to, I went on at some length explaining the origins of Fort Snelling, because that really is where the story of Pig's Eye and the founding of St. Paul begins. However, in the time that's elapsed since we recorded this episode, we've decided that the founding of Fort Snelling is such an important, interesting, relevant, and frequently misunderstood event in Minnesota history that it really warrants its own episode. So I've cut most of that section out here, because the very next episode we release will be entirely devoted to the establishment of Fort Snelling, and we didn't want to repeat ourselves too much. So, for the purposes of this episode, here's what you need to know. In 1820, the U.S. military built a fort, eventually named Fort Snelling, at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers. That's near the present-day MSP airport. The short-term goals of this fort were to police the fur trade, and its long-term goals were to provide a foothold for future U.S. territorial expansion into the homelands of the Dakota people. The government justified the building of this fort by pointing to a legally dubious treaty signed in 1805 that they claimed established a military reservation at the junction of the rivers, and we'll get into all the messy details of that treaty in the next episode. But what's crucial for our story now is that in the early days of the fort, theoretically no non-native people besides military personnel were supposed to be settling in the area. The land outside of this vaguely defined military reservation was still, on paper, acknowledged as unceded Dakota land. European Americans were not legally able to make land claims in Minnesota until 1838, when another treaty was ratified. However, despite this, by the mid-1820s, there were a couple hundred European Americans squatting on land near the fort, and it is from that community that we get the first St. Paulites, including a man known as Pig's Eye. All right, that's all you need to know for now. But again, there is much, much more to that story, so be sure to stay tuned for our next episode in which we'll give this complicated and controversial history the thorough treatment it deserves. But now, back to our conversation on Pig's Eye. There was actually a guy named Pierre Parrant, and he was nicknamed Pig's Eye. We don't know a lot about him. From what we can tell, he was likely of Métis or mixed ancestry. He was, quote, around 60 in 1838, and he, quote, spoke execrable English. He's said to have come to Minnesota from Sault Ste. Marie in Upper Michigan, though it's not known if that's where he was originally from. And that's pretty much all we know. He first shows up in the historical record in 1834 as a fur trader who loses his trading license for illegally selling alcohol to Native Americans. Otherwise, pretty much nothing's known about his backgrounds, but it seems that everybody universally regarded him as a nuisance. He did indeed open a saloon near Fort Snelling, but he was not the first and he was not alone.
Could you say that he had been officially labeled a disturber of the peace?
He was absolutely a disturber of the peace. But not alone. There was a whole sort of group of people that had settled just north of Fort Snelling. So Fort Snelling is near where the airport is today. It's at the junction of the Mississippi and the Minnesota River. Just north of that, basically between Fort Snelling and Minnehaha Falls, there was a collection of people settling. And some of them were French-speaking Swiss refugees from a failed colony near present-day Winnipeg. These were called the Selkirkers because their colony in Winnipeg was sponsored by the Scottish Lord Selkirk. But there's a bunch of these French speakers settling there. And some of them, along with former fur trade employees, open up shacks right near the fort in which they're selling liquor to the soldiers. Crucial to this, in 1834, the army does away with its whiskey ration. They used to give basically 6 ounces of whiskey to every soldier a day, and that was considered, one of the main reasons to sign up for the army. It was a perk. But the army does away with that in 1834, and it is not popular, especially in places like Fort Snelling, where there's absolutely nothing to do. So these sort of saloons that are right by the fort, it's a popular place, and it comes to be known informally as Rumtown. So this is where Pierre Parrant is. He's got one of these little grog shops in Rumtown, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. Now, in 1838, Colonel Plimpton, who was the commandant of Fort Snelling at the time, he orders them to leave the military reservation. Now, funny fact about this, according to this kind of sham of a treaty, there was land set aside for the military, but no one had ever mapped it out and no one ever actually knew where the borders were. So
why would they need to know
kind
that?
of vague. But previous commandants had let these people settle pretty close to the fort. This guy says, nope, now you're on the military land, you have to get out. And when they refused, he actually sent soldiers in to burn down Rumtown. So Pierre Parrant's first saloon presumably was among those that gets burned down.
You'd think a town called Rumtown would be pretty flammable.
And this is after, for example, there was one famous incident in which 2/3 of the soldiers at Fort Snelling after the 4th of July were locked up in the jail at the fort because they were too drunk and disorderly.
I think they were just too patriotic.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't punish them for that.
I agree, but apparently Colonel Plimpton didn't.
Boo.
So at this point, all these settlers that were there, they moved just a few miles downriver, and Parrant is among them. He moves and builds a saloon near Fountain Cave, which the cave is still there, but it's sealed up, but it's located right about where Randolph Avenue meets the Mississippi in St. Paul. And this saloon of his is what allegedly has the distinction of being the first building in St. Paul. So far, we're lining up with the story. Here's what the story gets wrong, though. For one, Pierre Pig's Eye Parrant was demonstrably not the first non-native settler of what is now St. Paul. At the time he's kicked off the military land and builds his saloon, there's nearly a dozen people with different claims and farmsteads in the surrounding area. So he's not the first. Also, he settles by Fountain Cave, and that's not within the city's limits until decades later. So where he settles first isn't even part of St. Paul at first. And he also doesn't stay there very long. He moved from Fountain Cave after only a few months. He moves a few more times in the next year. Basically, this is what a lot of people do, is you stake a claim and then you sell it to someone else. Then you settle somewhere else, stake a claim, sell that to someone else. You get a little chunk of money every time. And that's what he's doing. So he moves from Fountain Cave after a few months. He settles first near the upper landing, which is in early St. Paul, and then near the lower landing, and then further around the river bend to a lake that would eventually become known as Pig's Eye Lake, named after him. But what's crucial is each time that he's moving, there's already people there. So in no version of events is he the first person to settle or build anything in what would become St. Paul. And what's funny is even J. Fletcher Williams, whose quote we read earlier, he acknowledges this just a few pages after declaring that Parrant was the first. So he even contradicts his own text if you read it closely.
Because he says, it's well known that this is the first settler. Anyways, when he got there, this person was living there, and this person was living there, and this person was living there.
Yep, there was the Perry farmstead, there was the Gervais farmstead, there's a whole bunch of people already living there. Now, the last place that Parrant ends up, Pig's Eye Lake, that does get named after him, but that even today is outside the boundaries of St. Paul. It's in what's now Woodbury. So that's not the beginning of St. Paul. Now, the next claim is that the community was known as Pig's Eye or Pig's Eye Landing, and that you could send mail to Pig's Eye. But there's zero evidence from the period in question of anyone ever calling the settlement that. Allegedly, it was called Pig's Eye between 1838 to 1841, but if you look at the records from that time, there's no mention of Pig's Eye. And we have extensive records because we have two institutions here, the military and the Catholic Church, and they both keep really good records. The military has officers' correspondence and journals, surveys, censuses, official reports. The Catholic Church keeps parish records and history. Also, the first priest here, Lucien Galtier, he had correspondence which was later published, and he also wrote memoirs, and none of them mention Pig's Eye. The closest thing are later references in the 1850s, so 10, 15 years later, and you see references to Pig's Eye Landing at that time, which was a small boat landing near Pig's Eye Lake. So again, that's not in St. Paul. It's in what's now Woodbury. And it's just one of many landings because whoever put a dock up, they'd call that person's landing. So in early documents, we have references to Perry's Landing. That was by Abraham Perry's farm. There was Phelan's Landing. That was by Edward Phelan's farm. There was Guerin's Landing. You get the idea. So there's all these different boat landings, but that's not the name for the whole community. Now, years after the fact, there's one traveler, the Canadian Edmund Brisette. He was actually living with Pierre Parrant in the winter of 1838 and 1839.
Shacking up.
And he later wrote jokingly about sending a letter from Pig's Eyes Landing. So that would be the one in Woodbury. And he marked the sending address. That's the sending address, not the mailing address. You have to say where it's from. And he says it as Pig's Eye. And his remarks in context make it clear that A, he's not talking about St. Paul. B, he's not saying that's the name of the whole city. And it seems like this is just kind of his private little joke. But that, I think, is the kernel of what becomes this claim.
What are his remarks?
He says, "Once at a time, within the memory of several of our citizens, there flourished upon the plain before us a Frenchman named Parrant. He was a ruling spirit, and otherwise distinguished by all who had ever viewed him as notable for having one eye, unequally matched to its distant yoke mate, at precisely the shape of a pig's eye. He's best known as the man of this peculiar visual organization. His identity became, in the process of time, stamped with that name. On one occasion, a gentleman inditing an epistle at Parrant's desk dated the letter, for want of a more definite designation, Pig's Eye, such and such a month, 1842. The letter received, in return, was directed to Pig's Eye, in good faith. Hence the name."
Okay, so it was an inside joke, but they're already laughing and saying like, oh ho, someone didn't have a return address because he was living out in the middle of...
Right. There's no
This
kind of
newly,
addresses
like-
of it. And this is before there's any sort of official post office or anything.
And so he didn't have anything better to write, so he said
Right.
Pig's Eye, and then everyone thought it was really funny that it got addressed back to Pig's Eye.
Yep.
Okay.
But again, we're talking about a spot in Woodbury,
Right.
around the bend from what would become St. Paul. And we're talking about a letter to one particular little saloon, but there's lots of other cabins and
Right.
saloons and things.
Right.
There's no evidence from the time that the town was called Pig's Eye,
Right.
though that would become the later myth.
The joke was that it was addressed to Pig's Eye.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
So, what happened? Why is this endure?
Well, I think I found the smoking gun of who actually created this legend. And as far as legends go, it's an old one. It dates to 1850. So again, to clear up our timeline here, Parrant is here from 1838 to 1841. No one actually knows what happens to him after 1841. People just kind of lose track of him. But in 1850, you have a new newspaper called the St. Paul Pioneer, and it's written by editor James Goodhue. And he's, like many other people from 1850, coming here from New England. And Minnesota has just become a territory. It becomes a territory in 1849, so there's this huge land rush. And Goodhue tells a colorful and embellished story about Parrant in his newspaper, crediting him as the founder and namesake of the village. So pretty much the whole story as we still have it today comes from this article. It's actually from that article that we get that "Pig's eye, converted thou shalt be" quote that I read earlier. The thing about Goodhue is he'd only arrived a year earlier, and most of his early articles were, pardon my French, bullshit that he just completely made up, which
Wow,
was...
there's a lot of French in this podcast
Yes.
episode.
Which was par for the course for a 19th century frontier paper. And what's particularly notable is at this early date, the Pioneer wasn't even being sold in Minnesota. All the copies of this frontier newspaper that are being printed are being shipped east because its real goal at this point is to attract immigrants. It's a booster. They're trying to sell land. They're trying to get people to move here. So he's writing things for an East Coast audience to try to drum up the idea that this is an exciting place to go. Now, as another notion of Goodhue's relationship to truth, in the same paper, he brags that Minnesota's winters are, quote, exceedingly pleasant, among the mildest in the nation.
So he clearly knew what he was talking about.
Clearly. And in fact, actually, someone wrote into him calling him on that. And he clarifies later, what I meant to say was, we have no wind. And without wind, the winters feel fine.
What?
He was inside when he wrote that.
We have no
I mean, that
wind
is true that
here.
there's no wind.
He was indoors.
Now, it's worth noting that within a year, they are publishing the paper here. But when that early Pig's Eye thing is noted, it's only for an East Coast audience.
So it's like a little puff piece.
It's a sales pitch.
Okay.
He was a storyteller, and he'd presumably heard of this guy, Pig's Eye, that no one had seen him in 9 years. No one knew what happened to him. No one knew much about him before that. But he has a cool nickname, and I think James Goodhue had an eye for that, or near, rather.
He had a cool name, and no one was going to show up and be like, hey, that's not true.
Exactly.
Is there an element to it where it's like a game of telephone kind of thing too, where it's like he's probably like interviewing different people?
Oh, yeah.
Even if it's not intentionally trying to
Some
make
guy,
something up.
Yeah, some guy who loved to drink at Pig's Eye Saloon was like, he founded this town,
Oh,
man.
totally.
Like, we will, And then he's
But
like, oh, yeah.
a thing to keep in mind is at the time Goodhue's writing, there's probably around 3,000 people in the St. Paul area. And at the time Pig's Eye was here, there was less than 100. So, like, there's not that many people around.
Yeah.
Who were actually there. So he can kind of make up whatever backstory he wants. Right. He's writing for these people who are just coming. Now, regarding the name St. Paul, that name does come from Father Lucien Galtier, though he didn't name the town that.
He
never
didn't
chastised.
say the poem?
He didn't say the poem.
What?
He didn't. In fact, there's more to that poem.
Is it really long? Did people start to leave in the middle of the poem? Like they got about halfway in and they're like, we got stuff to do.
Here's what James Goodhue says in full that Lucien Galtier did. When one great city covers all, the ground from Pig's Eye to the falls, I then will claim St. Paul for mine, the child of 1849. Pig's Eye converted thou shalt be like Saul. Arise and be henceforth St. Paul.
Wow, it's like sort of like a St. Paul version of The Cat in the Hat.
It totally is.
I have an idea for a children's book.
Yep. So Lucien Galtier does establish the first Catholic church here, and it is just a little log cabin up on what's now Dayton's Bluff, and he dedicates the chapel to St. Paul. And he picks that name because he thought Paul is a natural companion to Peter, and at that time what we now call the Minnesota River was called the St. Peter's River. And if there was a name that referred to the general area, people called it St. Peter's. So, for example, the Indian Agency that was near Fort Snelling, it was officially known as the Indian Agency at St. Peter's. And if this area is called the St. Peter's, he thinks, I'm going to dedicate my chapel to St. Paul. Because Peter and Paul, they go together like
peanut butter?
Salt and pepper.
Like salt and pepper.
Paul and Peter.
Like Paul and Peter.
Salt and pepper.
In 1849, they changed it to the Minnesota River because we just titled this new territory Minnesota. And people were going, what's a Minnesota? And they're like, well, we're naming it after the river. But really, Minnesota, again, it means water that reflects the sky. It was a Dakota term for various bodies of water. And just generally, this area was Minnesota Makoche. So he names it St. Paul. But that's just the name of the church, not the name of anything else.
Okay.
But because it's the only church here, that's the name of the parish. And so when people get married or when they are born or die, and the Catholic Church is filling out their records of, baptism, wedding, etc., they list the parish as St. Paul's Parish. Now, in 1846, they get the first official post office, and it's right below this chapel. And they decide to call the post office St. Paul.
Okay.
But it's named after the parish, which is named after the church. There was no official city here until 1849. In the bill of legislation that created Minnesota Territory, it names the capital at St. Paul and says that there shall be a city created, and it gives the boundaries.
And then they say the poem.
They did not.
What?
No. So anyway, in a roundabout way, Lucien Galtier did name St. Paul by naming the church. But it's not this dramatic story that James Goodhue tells. But again, Galtier's gone. Pig's Eye's gone. Most of the people that are around, they're probably at the game of telephone point of telling their own stories, and they're mythologizing their own, just like we all like tell stories from when we were in college and we, you clean it up a bit. And because James Goodhue published this is what a lot of the people moving here read. So it just becomes part of the lore that St. Paul was called Pig's Eye. And my theory is that the reason Fletcher Williams, the first historian to write a detailed history of St. Paul, the reason he includes both the legend and then quietly contradicts it a few pages later, I think he was a good enough historian to realize the story was false, but he also realized people are going to expect this story and they're going to yell at me if I don't have it.
I can't not include it.
I can't not include it. So I'm just going to include it and then I'll quietly contradict it a few pages later.
And it's almost like your typical sort of Romulus and Remus myth, where it
Right.
kind of encompasses themes that were true of the actual settlement. Like, was it officially founded by a saloon owner? No. But did it arise out of some settlers from Rumtown? Yes. And did the priests stand on Dayton's Bluff and wave a cross over the city and say, I'm going to call you St. Paul? No. But it did take its name from that parish. So it's sort of like a mythologized version that contains themes that are accurate.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's easy to remember.
And it takes a complex, messy story, a bunch of people moving around for a bunch of reasons.
And it streamlines it.
And it streamlines it. You know, a lot of people were selling liquor illegally, and a lot of people were squatting near the fort illegally. So I call them land claims, but really they were just building a house and hoping someday I can claim this legally. Like, there'd been no official survey. There was no land office. So the origins of this community that becomes St. Paul is just people kind of grabbing land.
Well, yeah, and we're going to probably have to do another whole episode about like how people sort of started to realize the land around was going to be pretty lucrative someday, and so they were in a mad rush.
Yeah. But that is a messy story. But some of those early claims, like I said, there weren't many people around from that period, but there's a few exceptions, and they've become some of the like most notable, prominent citizens.
Yeah, because
some
it
of
worked.
these people who were part of this messy, complicated, kind of unseemly history, they're still around, but we want to make us look good. And if we can blame all the sort of liquor selling and squatting and everything on this one guy who's not around anymore and who has a name, Pig's Eye.
Yeah.
And it does seem like at the time nobody really liked him. So that's another thing in his.
So that's fair.
Yeah, it's everyone kind of remembered him. Nobody really knew him. Nobody really liked him. So we're taking this complicated settlement by a bunch of people. We're reducing it to the story of one guy, Pig's Eye. That represents the early kind of Wild West days of St. Paul.
Well, it's like Gaultier versus Pig's Eye.
Yeah, and then
It's
Gaultier
like,
comes
those
in
are
and
the two team
brings
captains.
civilization with a capital C to this rough and tumble wilderness. And that's the story this whole pioneer generation like to tell themselves, that they're bringing civilization to wilderness.
It fits really well in with like the Manifest Destiny.
Well, and it's interesting how quickly they kind of want to make St. Paul do it. Like, I think a lot of other cities or states are like, we were the Old West for so long. Come here and see our gold town or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, we had that one guy for a little bit, but then the Catholics came and everything was great.
Yep.
Like, it's a weird
And
rushing
I
through.
think there's a couple things going on there. And part of it is this is a story being made up by the people that are actively trying to sell land in St. Paul.
Right.
So
Right,
they
they
have
don't
to
want
say
the
we're
Wild
They
past
do
our
not want
Wild
it
West
to,
days.
yeah, they want it to
We're
seem like there's
real-
opportunity here, but also there's an established order.
And whatever stories you've heard, we're respectable now. And it's also
all
worth
better.
noting, it's a Catholic priest that gets to play this role of civilizer. And the 1840s and 50s are a time generally of virulent anti-Catholicism in the United States. There was this sort of assumed Protestant hegemony, and Catholics were often stereotyped as backward and superstitious and uncivilized and barbaric. And Minneapolis and St. Anthony, the towns just around the river band, they were incredibly Protestant towns. Whereas because of these early French-speaking Catholics that settle in St. Paul had a reputation as a Catholic town. So I think in some ways this story is also a way of kind of flipping the script on the way Catholics were viewed. Like the Catholics get to be the hero in this version of the story.
Do you think that was also maybe trying to roll out a little bit more of a welcome mat to maybe Catholics from back east who wanted to come out and
Come
it's
to
like
our
Possibly, yeah.
cool Catholic town.
Yeah, I think it's trying to make the Catholics not seem scary. So
you
James
think?
Goodhue, I think, was a Protestant, and he's
Okay.
writing to New England towns that are mostly Protestant. But Father Lucien Gaultier gets to be this bringer of civilization rather than, corrupt agents of the Pope or whatever the
So why do you
conspiracy
think, if
theories
Goodhue
were.
was Protestant, why do you think he cast a Catholic in that like sort of
I think because
establishing
undeniably
civilization?
that church is where the name St. Paul comes
Okay.
from.
Yeah.
So he had to work with the materials he's given.
Yeah.
He can't fabricate everything. Just
And it
most
was,
things.
if you arrived in St. Paul in 1849, you would notice, there's a large Catholic presence here, which was different than Minneapolis, which was different than Hastings, which was different than Eau Claire, all these other cities that you could move to at that time. St. Paul grows around this nucleus of early settlers that were here from that
From the Selkirkers.
failed colony in Selkirk.
Yes.
And a lot of they were Catholic.
Oh, okay.
And the French Canadian fur traders They were Catholic.
Okay.
So there's this Catholic presence at what becomes St. Paul. Minneapolis starts as a business. There's a waterfall there, and it's claimed by the military until they sell it off, and it's sold to a bunch of New Englanders.
Okay.
And they advertise this as the New England of the West. And they get a bunch of people from Maine and Massachusetts and upstate New York, very Protestant, like specifically like Congregationalist, descendant of the Puritans type Protestants. And that is who's settling Minneapolis. And it's very much this planned business opportunity, whereas St. Paul does grow up more organically, more as a kind of rough and tumble scramble for
and maybe
claims.
more from inviting people that maybe have more of a draw to move somewhere that's a little more welcoming.
And what becomes is like, so as the Irish start moving west, if they're Catholic, they're going to settle where they feel welcome and move on from where they don't. So the Irish tend to settle in St. Paul and not Minneapolis because St. Paul was the place that already had a Catholic church and Minneapolis didn't. There's still this kind of stereotype that like St. Paul is the Irish Catholic city and Minneapolis is the more Protestant waspy city. And of course, both cities are incredibly diverse today, and there's representatives of all faiths and ethnicities. But that stereotype from the earliest days still kind of lingers a bit in the sort of sense of place. And it's because we have stories like the legend of Pig's Eye.
Wow.
Which are a complex mixture of fact and, pardon my French, bullshit.
And that's it for this episode. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into Minnesota's storied past. You can find detailed show notes for this and all episodes at minnesotaunknown.com/podcast. We'll post a link there to each episode along with features such as accompanying images, links to more info, and lists of sources cited. If you have questions, comments, corrections, complaints, or compliments, please email us at info@minnesotaunknown.com. We'd truly love to hear from you. Unless it's mean, and then I'll cry. You can find Minnesota Unknown wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe or follow so you don't miss an episode. And if you have a moment to rate and review, that would really help others find us. We also give history walking tours around the Twin Cities. To learn more about our current and upcoming tours, head to minnesotaunknown.com. Minnesota Unknown is produced, hosted, written, and researched by Hannah Norton, Josie Bergman, and Alex Weston. Our theme song is by Union Shakedown. This episode is copyright 2026 by Minnesota Unknown, LLC. All rights reserved.
And the cat is eating the microphone right
The
now,
cat is purring directly into the
We are
microphone.
recording with
Mary,
multiple cats.
I'm going to put her in jail.
We shall pause for the cat.
For Petit?
Cat noir. That poster that everyone has from Abu Dhabi.
Mary, stop eating
Le Chat Noir. But everyone themed their kitchens after it in the early 2000s.
He spoke execrable. I can never read that one.
Execrable.
Execrable. I don't know how to read.
Execrable.
He spoke execrable.
We can get that.
Execrable.
He spoke
Execrable.
English. His habits were intemperate and
Licentious.
licentious. I can't read today.
Where are you, Pig's Eye? Why can't I find you?